troops and the tactical abilities of American commanders had been fully borne out by events. As a result, Roosevelt's position was to a certain extent undermined, and his preferred strategic priority, an early attack on the French coast, was quietly postponed in favor of the British proposal for an invasion of Italy. Neither Roosevelt, however, nor his senior military advisors were entirely happy with this outcome, and as the campaign progressed, they would gradually withdraw their support, insisting on the transfer of men and equipment to Britain in preparation for the projected invasion of France. The possibility of an invasion of Sicily was first raised in London at a meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the summer of 1942. At the Casablanca Conference early in the following year, the proposal was adopted as official Allied strategy, subject to one important qualification, namely that the campaign would not interfere with the preparations in Britain for a cross-channel attack on the French coast, scheduled for early in 1944. Although initially opposed to the idea and doubtful of the military value of such an operation, American planners were conscious of the need to maintain the momentum built up in North Africa. The clearance of Tunisia was taking longer than expected, and when it was finally completed, there would be huge forces available for a summer campaign. In addition, most of the principal North African ports had been brought up to full operating capacity, and all the necessary infrastructure established to maintain and service 16 full divisions in the field. For the British, Sicily was a tempting target. Situated in the center of the Mediterranean, the island was only a little more than 100 miles from the major Allied North African ports of Tunis and Bizerta. Airfields on the Tunisian plain, along with others on the North African coast, would ensure adequate tactical air support for an invasion attempt, while those on the islands of Malta and Pantelleria would provide virtually constant fighter cover. Possession of these islands also provided the Allies with comparatively secure sea lanes for the final approach of the invasion convoys. If Sicily was captured easily, follow-up operations could be mounted across the Strait of Messina, or even, in the event of an Italian collapse, higher up the peninsula. The capture of Sicily would also give the Allies absolute control over the central Mediterranean and provide additional airfields to prosecute the air war against Italy's ports and cities. The assault landings were to take place in two sectors: south of Syracuse on the east coast by the British 8th Army, and between Licata and Scoliti on the south coast by the American 7th Army. Among the primary objectives in the American sector was the capture of Axis airfields north of Gela. Primary British objectives included the capture of Syracuse and Axis airfields in the southeast corner of the island. Once the beachhead was established, the important east coast ports of Augusta and Catania were to be taken, along with a further group of airfields to the west. The final reduction of Sicily was to be accomplished by a general advance on either side of Mount Etna, to the north coast and the town of Messina, the capture of which would isolate any remaining Axis forces still fighting in the west. During the spring of 1943, while these plans were being refined and the invasion force assembled and trained, Allied air power was employed against targets in Italy and Sicily. These included ports, airfields and military bases, all of which were attacked heavily. Coastal shipping was harassed, and fighter and reconnaissance sweeps over southern Italy were incessant. The underlying objectives of the air plan, in addition to ongoing reconnaissance, were the destruction of the Luftwaffe and the Italian Air Force in the south, the isolation of Sicily by strategic and tactical bombing of the island's communication links, and the steady erosion of Italian morale by systematic attacks on the island's defences. Heavy bomber raids on industrial targets and major population centres on the Italian mainland were intended to disperse the concentration of effort and generally undermine Italy's already wavering commitment to the Axis. After Stalingrad, Hitler's main priority was to strengthen his position in the east. With the recapture of Kharkov, Army Group South had halted the rout of Axis forces from the Don steppe and anchored the front along the line of the Donets. North of Kharkov, however, the front line curved dangerously around a huge bulge, created in February when Soviet forces overran the Axis satellite armies on the upper Don. Yet the Wehrmacht was no longer the force it had been in 1941, when 3 million men had stormed through the Soviet Union to within 20 miles of Moscow. Nor was there any possibility, in the near future, of a return to Stalingrad or Moscow. The task for the Wehrmacht in 1943 would be to straighten the line in the east through a series of limited offensive operations in preparation for a long war of attrition. The bulge in the front line stretched from just south of Orel to Belgorod and was being continuously fortified by the Russians in expectation of an attack. Hitler's plan was to mount concentric offensives from the north and south towards the city of Kursk in the center of the salient. The attack in the north would be spearheaded by the 9th Army, heavily reinforced from Army Group Center's reserve. The attack in the south would be led by the 4th Panzer Army, supported by the 8th Army, both part of Army Group South. The objective of the campaign was to pinch out the salient and isolate the Soviet forces west of Kursk. This would, it was hoped, deal a damaging blow to the Red Army, and by straightening the line, enable the Wehrmacht to go over to the defensive, releasing men and formations for service in the west. By reinforcing the German-Italian forces in North Africa, Hitler, by design or inadvertently, had prolonged the conflict in the region into the early summer of 1943. The consequent Allied build-up that was to lead to the invasion of Sicily also ensured that there would be no major landings on the French coast before 1944. With France safe from attack for another year, Hitler could devote most of his dwindling resources in the West to the defense of southern Europe. but he had no clear idea.